Chapter 9. The Fight for the Chest. Captain Jack Sparrow sat in a rowing boat, holding his bottle of earth. Elizabeth and Norrington were sitting opposite him. Pintel and Ragetti were rowing the boat toward Ila Cruz. "You're rowing too fast," Pintel said to his one-eyed friend.
"You're rowing too slowly,"
Ragetti answered.
"We don't want the Kraken to catch us."
Jack was nervous when he heard the monster's name. Then they heard a sudden noise in the water, and the two pirates rowed the boat faster. When they reached the beach, Jack jumped out of the boat. He checked that the letters were still in his jacket pocket. Then he placed the jacket and the bottle of earth at the end of the boat. "Guard the boat," he ordered Pintel and Ragetti. Jack put the compass into Elizabeth's hands, and they walked up the beach. Norrington followed them. They came to an old church. "Do people live here?" Norrington asked. "No," Elizabeth answered. "Do you know this place?" he asked, surprised. "I've heard stories about it," Elizabeth said. "A religious man came to the island and brought illness and death. All the people died. The man went crazy and killed himself." Elizabeth looked down at the compass and continued to walk. Suddenly, the compass point began to move wildly. "We found the place," she said. Jack drew an X in the sand with the toe of his boot. "Make a hole here," he said to Norrington. At the same time, the Flying Dutchman arrived near Ila Cruz, and Davy Jones noticed the rowing boat.
"They're here," he said angrily, "and I can't step on land again for 10 years.
"Can we do the job for you?" Marcus asked him.
"I'll punish you if you fail," Jones promised. "Take the ship down below the ocean," he ordered his men.
Marcus called out,
"Down! Down!"
In seconds, the Flying Dutchman ship disappeared below the waves and moved toward Ila Cruz. Pintel and Ragetti were sitting on the beach and looking out at the ocean. The water began to move. Something was coming toward them. They jumped to their feet. Then they ran to tell Jack. Jack watched Norrington as he made a deep hole in the sand. Jack was worried, and he wanted to find the chest quickly. Suddenly, Norrington hit something.
"It's the chest,"
Jack said, and jumped into the hole. They lifted out the chest, and Jack quickly broke open the lock. Inside were a long white dress, dried flowers, and old love letters. Jack pushed them away and found a box. He lifted the box out of the chest. It was tightly locked, but he could hear a noise inside it. "The heart," Elizabeth said. "It's real." Norrington was surprised. "You were right," he said to Jack. "I'm often right," Jack said, "but people are still surprised." "With good reason," a voice said. The group turned and saw Will Turner. He was running toward them in wet clothes. Elizabeth ran to him. "Will, you're all right." She put her arms around his neck. Jack looked worried. "How did you get here?" he asked Will. "With difficulty," Will said. "But I want to thank you, Jack. You tricked me onto that ship to pay Jones." "What?" Elizabeth said, looking at Jack. "And then I met my father." "That's okay," Jack said nervously. "Everything you said to me, every word was untrue?" Elizabeth said. She looked angrily at Jack. "Yes." Then the happy smile left Jack's face. Will was on his knees next to the chest. He held the key in one hand and his father's knife in the other. "What are you doing?" Jack asked. "I'm going to kill Jones," Will answered. In a second, Jack was pressing his sword against Will's neck. "You can't do that, William,"
Jack said. "Who will stop the Kraken if Jones is dead? Now, give me the key, please." Will quickly pushed away Jack's sword. He jumped up and took Elizabeth's sword. "I keep my promises," he said, facing Jack. "I'm going to free my father." But suddenly, Norrington pulled out his sword and turned to Will. "You can't keep the key, sorry." Jack looked at Norrington and smiled. "You're going to help me?" he said happily. Norrington pointed his sword quickly toward Jack. "No," he said. "Lord Beckett wants that chest. He'll make me a Commodore again if I give it to him." The three men began to fight. "Will," Jack said urgently, "Norrington can't keep the chest. Believe me." Will looked at him. "I don't believe anything that you say," he shouted. "Don't listen to him," Norrington said. "Jack just wants Elizabeth for himself." The three men jumped back and continued to fight. "Guard the chest," Will told Elizabeth. "No, adult men talk about their problems. They don't fight," Elizabeth shouted. But the men weren't listening. Ragetti stood in the trees and watched the fight. "What's happening?" Pintel asked. He stood next to Ragetti, and they both looked at the chest. Ragetti tried to explain. "Each man wants the chest. Mr. Norrington hopes to give it to Lord Beckett. Then Beckett will free him. Jack wants to sell the chest to Beckett and save himself. And Turner thinks it will help his cursed old father." "How sad," Pintel said. "That chest is clearly very important." He looked at Ragetti, and the two men walked quietly toward the chest. Elizabeth fell to the sand and closed her eyes. "Maybe they'll think I'm sick. Then they'll stop fighting," she thought. She didn't move for a long time. When she opened her eyes, she saw Pintel and Ragetti. They were running away with the chest. She jumped to her feet. "Shall I tell Will or follow the chest?" she asked herself. The three men were still fighting. She decided to follow the chest. Chapter 10. Jack's Big Mistake. The three men were moving across the island as they fought. Norrington pushed Will hard, and he dropped the key. It flew through the air and fell into Jack's hand. "Ha-ha!" Jack screamed. He ran away down the beach. Norrington and Will quickly followed him. Holding the key tightly, Jack went into the old church and climbed some wooden stairs. High above him, the bones of the old churchman hung from a chain. Jack said "Hello" to him and continued his climb. Norrington and Will quickly followed Jack up the stairs. Norrington attacked Jack with his sword, but Jack stepped away. Norrington ran at him, took the key, and threw Jack down the stairs. As Jack fell, his hand found the dead churchman's chain. Jack and the churchman dropped down together. At the same time, Will, holding on to a second chain, was pulled up toward Norrington. As he passed the Commodore, he took the key. Then he ran out onto the church roof. On the beach, the water started to move again. Slowly, the heads of Jones's sailors came up out of the pale blue water. The men walked across the beach and stood next to the empty hole. Then they saw Will Turner step out onto the church roof. Will was trying to escape from Jack, Norrington, and now from Jones's men. He jumped across a hole in the roof. Using the point of his sword, Norrington lifted the key from Will's hand. The Commodore held it for a second. Then it disappeared. Jack had it again. Norrington turned angrily and knocked Jack's sword from his hand. He looked over his shoulder at Will. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm going to kill the man who destroyed my life." "That's okay," Will answered. Jack held up one finger. "Let's talk about this, Commodore. Are you sure you have the right man?" Will smiled. Jack was trying to save himself again. "You caught a famous pirate and put him in prison," Jack said. "You wanted to marry a beautiful woman. Who freed the pirate and stole your girl?" Jack turned toward Will. Norrington stopped Jack. "You've said enough," he shouted, and pushed his sword wildly at Jack. Jack threw up his hands and screamed. He fell down the roof, and the key dropped to the ground. "Good work," Will said. "But sadly, Mr. Turner, he was right," Norrington said. He turned his sword toward Will. Norrington hated Jack, but he didn't like Will either. Down on the ground, Jack picked up the key and ran. "I'm on your side, friend," he called up to Will. Jack slowed to a walk and put the key around his neck. "I'm safe now," he said to himself. Then he fell into a hole in the ground. Will jumped onto a large wooden water wheel on the side of the church. Norrington jumped on too. With a loud noise, the wheel suddenly broke away from the wall. It began to move across the ground with the two men on top of it. Jack was hit by the wheel when he finally pulled himself out of the hole. The key fell away from his neck and caught on the wheel. "I've lost the key again," he said. He started to run after the wheel. Elizabeth finally reached Pintel and Ragetti in the trees. "Hello, love," Pintel said, and smiled. He and Ragetti put down the chest and pulled out their swords. Elizabeth reached for her sword, but it wasn't in her belt. Will had it, she suddenly remembered. The two pirates attacked her, but suddenly something crashed through the trees. They turned and saw the water wheel. Jack was running behind it. Pintel and Ragetti turned back to Elizabeth, but then a knife hit a tree next to Ragetti's head. Jones's men were coming. Pintel and Ragetti dropped their swords at Elizabeth's feet, took the chest, and started to run. With a sword in each hand, Elizabeth ran through the trees behind them. The pirates tried to run around a tree, one each side of it, but they were holding the chest between them. As they stopped, Jones's men arrived. Ragetti, Pintel, and Elizabeth looked at the chest, and then at the terrible sailors. They all made the quick decision to leave the chest on the ground. On another part of the island, Jack was still running after the wheel and the key. He ran quickly, got close to the wheel, and jumped inside it. Will reached down from the top of the wheel. He took the key before Jack could. Then he also jumped inside the wheel. Norrington followed him quickly. Cutting Will with his sword, Jack took the key again. He climbed on top of the wheel and then jumped into a tree. Hanging from the tree, Jack noticed one of Jones's sailors. He was coming toward the tree, and he was carrying the chest. Jack reached for a piece of wood and threw it at the sailor's head. The wood knocked the undead sailor's head off his shoulders. Jack jumped out of the tree and looked around. He couldn't see anybody. With the key in hand, he carefully walked up to the chest. Jack sat down next to the chest and turned the key in the lock. And there it was, Jones's heart. Taking off his shirt, he put the heart inside it. Then he looked around again. Nobody was watching him. He ran straight to the rowing boat and found his bottle. It was large enough and had a wide top. He emptied some of the earth onto the beach and placed the covered heart inside the bottle. Then he filled the bottle with sand. He looked up when he heard a sudden noise. Pintel, Ragetti, and Elizabeth ran out of the trees. The two men were carrying the chest again, and Jones's sailors were close behind them.
Elizabeth fought Jones's men bravely, but she was losing the fight. Then the big wheel crashed out of the trees and knocked down some of Jones's men. Elizabeth escaped to Pintel and Ragetti, and they pulled the chest through the sand toward the rowing boat. Jack was unhappy. There were too many people on the beach. He put his bottle back into the end of the rowing boat and watched. The wheel finally stopped near the water, and Will and Norrington climbed out. Norrington fell into the rowing boat. He lifted his head, saw Jack's bottle, and reached toward it. Jack watched carefully. Then Norrington's hand moved past the bottle and reached for the letters in Jack's coat pocket. Jack didn't stop him, because he didn't need the papers now. He had the heart. Davy Jones and every ship on the ocean were his. The fight on the beach between Sparrow's men and Jones's men continued. Suddenly, Will noticed the chest. The key was in the lock, and he started to open it. Jack quickly turned around and hit him, and Will fell. Elizabeth ran to his side and looked down at him. "We're not going to escape," she said to Norrington. "Not with the chest," he replied. He quickly took the chest and ordered her into the boat. "Don't wait for me," he called as he disappeared from the beach into the trees. Jones's men followed him. "We must listen to him," Jack said quickly. "Yes," Pintel agreed and pushed the rowing boat into the water. Jack picked up his bottle. With the heart and Tia Dalma's earth inside it, he was safe. "We have to take Will," Elizabeth ordered. Jack looked angry, but agreed. Pintel and Ragetti pulled Will into the boat. Without another word, they left the island and Norrington behind. Chapter 11. The End of Captain Jack. Jack's men were soon back on the Black Pearl. Will slowly opened his eyes. "What happened to the chest?" he asked. "Norrington took it. Jones's men followed him," Elizabeth told him. Gibbs came and welcomed them all onto the ship. He was ready to sail. "Jack," he said, "we saw the Dutchman an hour ago. She was coming around the end of the island." "Was she?" Jack replied. He didn't seem worried. "The most dangerous ship on the ocean is too close to us," Gibbs called to the other sailors. "Pull up the sails." Jack felt no need to hurry. He sat down and held his bottle tightly to him. "Gibbs, is your mouth dry?" he asked. "Is your heart moving quickly in your chest?" "Yes," Gibbs answered. "I think you're afraid," Jack told him. "Well, aren't you afraid too?" Gibbs said. He didn't understand Jack. Where was the frightened captain of only a few hours before? Elizabeth walked across the ship to the two men. She agreed with Jack. "We're in no danger," she said to Gibbs. "I can't see any ships." She spoke too quickly. As they watched, the ocean began to move. Suddenly the Flying Dutchman came up from below the water and stopped next to the Pearl. Jack turned toward the Dutchman and lifted the bottle above his head. He pointed to it, smiled, and gave a friendly wave. On the Dutchman, Davy Jones realized what he meant. "He's got my heart." He turned to Macus. "Prepare the guns," he said. "We're here! Yoo-hoo! Let's talk," Jack shouted. "What are you doing?" Gibbs asked angrily. "Be quiet," Jack replied. He lifted the bottle again. "I have the heart in here," he said quietly. "Really? How?" Gibbs asked. Jack smiled. "I'm Captain Jack Sparrow, remember? Nobody is smarter than me." Gibbs knew very well that Jack wasn't always right. "I have to protect the ship," he said, and shouted, "Move to the left! Hurry, men!" The Black Pearl sailed away from the Dutchman. The Dutchman's guns began to shoot, but the Pearl was escaping. "Can the Black Pearl move faster than the Dutchman?" Will asked. "That isn't a natural ship," Gibbs said, pointing to the Flying Dutchman. "It can sail into the wind and not lose speed. That's how it catches other ships. But if the wind is behind us—" "We can move faster than her," Will said. Suddenly, he understood Gibbs's plan. "Yes," Gibbs said. "The Black Pearl is the only ship that Davy Jones fears." Jack smiled and held his bottle close to his chest. "We can take the Dutchman," Will said to Jack. "We can turn and fight." "Or we can run away," Jack answered brightly. "You have the only ship that can take the Dutchman in a fair fight." "But I don't like to fight fairly," Jack said. Suddenly, the Black Pearl moved to one side and sailors fell to the floor. Jack's bottle was knocked from his hands and broke. Sand and earth went everywhere. Jack fell to his knees and looked through it. There was nothing in there except sand. Jack looked up at Gibbs. I don't have the heart." "Then who does?" Gibbs asked. Jack turned pale. He didn't have Jones's heart, and he didn't have Tia Dalma's earth. The Pearl stopped moving, and Elizabeth looked out at the ocean. "Have we hit some rocks?" she called. "I heard those words on the Edinburgh Trader," remembered Will. "No," he shouted. "It's not rocks. Move back." "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, seeing the fear in Will's eyes. "The Kraken," Gibbs said. "It's coming for Jack." The men on the Pearl were silent. Jack stopped looking through the sand on the floor of the ship. The heart wasn't there, and the black mark was on his hand again. Very quietly, Jack moved toward the end of the Pearl. None of his men saw him climb into a small boat. He rowed quickly away from his ship. The water around the Pearl began to move as, slowly, the Kraken came up out of the ocean. "Go to the guns!" Will shouted. "Protect the ship!" The pirates quickly prepared for the monster's attack. The Kraken's long arms moved onto the ship, but the guns were ready. Will ordered the men to shoot the monster. Badly hurt, the Kraken moved away. It broke all the ship's small rowing boats as it went down. "It will return," Will shouted. Turning to Elizabeth, he said, "Get off the ship." "There are no boats," Elizabeth replied. "The Kraken destroyed all of them." Not all of them. As the Kraken prepared to attack again, Jack rowed away more quickly, but something stopped his escape. When he looked down at his compass, it was pointing toward the Black Pearl and his men. Sadly, Jack began to row back again. On the Pearl, the Kraken was winning the fight. The pirates shot at it repeatedly, but they couldn't stop it. Elizabeth stood in the captain's room, with a gun in her shaking hands. She was very angry. "Jack has disappeared," she said to herself. "He's the person that the Kraken wants. He brought us into this mess." Then, as the Kraken's arms moved slowly through the windows toward her, she dropped the gun. She ran up to the top of the ship, and into Jack. He was back. "We have some time. Leave the ship," he ordered. "Can we really escape in a rowing boat?" Will asked. "We can return to the island. We can escape while the Kraken takes down the Pearl." Jack's eyes showed his sadness at the thought of the end of his ship. Will, Gibbs, and the other pirates went toward the rowing boat. "Thank you, Jack," Elizabeth said softly. She moved closer to him. "You came back. I always knew that you were a good man." She kissed the pirate, then stepped back slowly. There was a sharp noise. Jack looked down at his hands.
"I've chained you to the side of the Pearl," Elizabeth explained. "The Kraken wants you, not the ship, and not us." "You're a great pirate," Jack said. Elizabeth looked at him for the last time and remembered so much and so many adventures. Then she ran off the ship and left Jack waiting. Slowly, the Kraken's arms moved onto the Pearl, and the monster's head moved toward Jack. Its mouth was open, and in its teeth was Jack's lost, much-loved hat. He took it out of the monster's mouth and placed it on his head. From the rowing boat, the pirates of the Black Pearl watched the Kraken and Jack fight. Slowly, the terrible monster covered the ship with its body. Then it pulled the ship and Jack down below the waves. Davy Jones stood on the Flying Dutchman and smiled. "Jack Sparrow," he said happily, "now I have you." Jones was not the only person watching from the Dutchman. As Jack went down with the ship, Bootstrap Bill watched the water too. Sadly, he remembered Jack Sparrow, Captain Jack Sparrow. "I thought you could do it," he said quietly. "Only you." The Black Pearl and her captain were gone, and already the world seemed a darker place without them.